How Comic Hour with your host, Andrew Glonner.
And Chris Ramos.
And tonight we're joined by our special guests,
Anna Coleman.
Tonight we are reviewing God Loves, Man Kills, an X-Men story written by Chris Claremont and Brent Anderson. And this is part of our groundbreaking runs.
Yes, one of the old X-Men stories coming back, actually becoming more popular lately. I see it pop up more and more.
Yes.
I think people are just getting used to looking at the history of the X-Men or the history of, the Avengers, or it's just realizing that some of these characters they're seeing in movies and just in pop culture, that they have a 60-year history that, it's time to kind of read through that.
But before we jump into that, Anna, tell us about your comic book journey. How did you start reading comics?
Sure. So my first introduction to comics was actually on a road trip to Tennessee with my family. So I was about 8 or 9 years old, and my parents said, okay, get some books and some things for the car ride. And so my mom took me to the store and let me pick out some books. Being a good 90s kid that I was, I chose Goosebumps. And then they also had some comics. They had Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and they had some of the Archie comics. And so I took those too. So that was my first introduction to comics, which is not most people's kind of classic like superhero comics. Sure. But I watched a lot of cartoons as a kid, a lot of the ones from like the 70s and 80s, like the Super Friends.
The Super Friends!
Yeah. And I was also
and those are made for everyone,
Yeah. And I was also big into the X-Men comics, or the X-Men animated series that came out in the 90s. And so then when I had the Scholastic Book Fair at school.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Everybody gets their favorite books. At
the gateway to
yes.
Yes. I actually saw that they had an X-Men comic at the Scholastic Book Fair. And I was like, oh, I love that show. I would love to read about this too. So as a young kid, I never really made the connection that like the comics came first. And then, as I grew older, I realized that. And when I was a teenager, I started getting more into graphic novels. And a lot of Alan Moore stuff was kind of my big intro to graphic novels. But yeah.
Well, that kind of happens nowadays. People see shows on Netflix or movies, and then, some of us are like, oh, that's a comic book. It's been a comic book for 20 years. Right. And they're like, really? That's weird, So you never really know where these stories are, starting, because once they kind of come into more mainstream, I guess.
Right.
That's a good way to say it. The cool thing is there's a lot of little hidden gems out there, like this story.
Yes.
God Loves, Man Kills was huge in its time. Came out in 1982. So the X-Men were kind of like back. Remember, they started?
Yeah. They got rebooted in the Uncanny X-Men.
Yeah. So they started. The X-Men first came out in 1963. And then by like the end of the 60s, they kind of fizzled out. It was a really good idea at the time, but I don't think it was just up to the other.
Right. They didn't have a direction or something to stand out among the Avengers, the Fantastic Four. I think it was something just to give it the pop more.
I think, Marvel it wasn't new, but it was able to just start coming out with some of these more original stories. Mm-hmm. And I think people just became really loyal to like the original characters. Like they were loyal to like Captain America, like really loyal to the Fantastic Four. It was like, and when you try to introduce multiple characters, people were like, I don't know. And those stories, maybe they weren't so, very good. So they stopped printing those. And then in 1975, they came out with Giant Size X-Men #1, which has these characters in it.
Yeah.
And Chris Claremont. And that's when the X-Men from 1975, that's when they kind of like
came into their own.
Really hit their stride. Yeah.
I would say. Chris Claremont, he's been doing the X-Men and he still continues to write X-Men comics.
Yeah, periodically. Yeah.
He's been doing it for about 50 years. And so at this point, he was kind of in the early stages of his run. He still had a good development of the characters, gave them identities and voices. But then he's like, I have this really cool epic story, but I want it to be like standalone so that anybody can pick up this X-Men story and figure out this is what the X-Men's all about.
Yeah, because probably one of the most popular stories ever was the Dark Phoenix saga.
Yes.
And that came out in 1980. And this came out in 82. So
Okay.
that's why in the book you kind of see where they're like, we don't want anyone else to die. It was like, oh, someone's missing.
Right. That's one of the big things.
And it's like counting everyone up from the animated series. Something's missing.
Right.
Right. So I guess just to mention that briefly.
I did notice Jean Grey. There was no Jean Grey. There was
that's it.
a significant lack of Jean Grey.
And it took years for her to come back. So it was really like at the time, it was
try
really
to make
heartfelt.
it stick a little bit.
Yeah.
So I guess since we brought that up, we'll kind of give you a little roster of X-Men characters. We have Professor X, leader of the X-Men. We have Wolverine, Kitty Pryde, who also goes by Shadowcat. Storm.
And in this one, she's named Sprite.
Sure.
That's her.
Yeah, because everybody remembers Sprite.
That's her really early name.
Shadowcat was definitely the 90s series.
Yeah.
Like this has... I was very surprised to see Nightcrawler without Rogue because I definitely followed the 90s animated series
or Gambit.
story.
Yeah. And in the X-Men, not to break your run there, but they've had tons of characters, but they always had like sort of the top
the core.
7
Sure.
Yeah.
So after Kitty Pryde is
Colossus.
Yes, he's been around.
Ever. Nightcrawler and Cyclops.
So pretty much everyone on the original X-Men except Iceman and Beast and things because
Angel and those guys.
Was it at this time where they kind of broke off into X Factor?
Yep.
Yeah, so they're not like X-Men. They kind of the original team.
Yeah.
The OGs went away.
Right. How would you describe Kitty Pryde's costume, Anna?
With the
green and yellow.
Yeah, so I actually thought that was really bright for her.
Yes.
Because of her power of phasing through things. I'm used to seeing her in kind of more muted colors.
Yeah, sort of the traditional like yellow with black.
Yeah, or sometimes like on the animated series, I remember her like when she was Kitty Pryde and not Shadowcat, I remember her wearing a lot of light blues, grays, like more muted colors that kind of made you think of like phasing into a background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was like, oh, she had that costume. Oh, she had that costume.
Yeah. And with like the bright red gloves and the red shoes. And it's a big change.
Right. Well, it's like a dancer outfit.
Right. I was going to say like Dazzler. She would fit right in with Dazzler's group.
And, what happened was after this story, and I think in the next few years here, Wolverine sort of took a liking to her as far as like he felt like he has to protect her.
Yeah, he's a very big mentor figure.
So he started teaching her like, hey, kid, if you're going to be able to survive, this is what you need to know.
Right.
And that's when she started getting her darker costumes. And Wolverine was like training her to use a sword and like the ways of the samurai and things.
Yeah.
And eventually there are some really great moments in the books where she starts learning how to phase just pieces of her.
Okay.
So like she'll be in a sword fight and like Wolverine will sort of train her like when a sword's coming at you, she literally only phases the width of the blade.
Oh.
So when a blade comes to her, she like phases only her arm and then she still is attacking. So she starts learning that because of Wolverine. So she really becomes just like anybody else in here. She has this full arc,
Sure.
But the one thing I like about God Loves Man Kills, number one, it starts off as a pretty typical X-Men story, right? Like, a mutant is being hunted. You're just like, oh, that's how it is. I guess we should also mention for the podcast, because we always tell people to get the new collected editions, the bigger editions, the treasury editions, hardcovers, all of that. They came out with the treasury edition, which Anna,
the gallery edition.
Gallery edition. Anna, you read that. So the beginning has a special...
The extended cut.
Yes.
So what happened with the extended cut was in 2019... I don't know who approached the table, whether it was Chris Claremont who approached the table or Marvel approached the table, but they asked him, hey, would you like to do a few more pages of God Loves Man Kills? Yes, there's already been a sequel to God Loves Man Kills. terrible. But if you just want to add on to a little bit of the story, just to give it what the sense of the world was, give more context to what was going on, maybe put a little more concepts to it, because they could do more with it. They they've extended some of that out, but just to put it in that time period, I think was well. And they brought the artist back, which was Brent Anderson, that teamed up with Chris Claremont, the original writer, and those two both sat down and did about 8 pages.
Yeah, they did sort of a soft intro, right? I mean, it helped. Did it help you sort of jump into the story?
It did, I think, to give it kind of that preface of Kitty Pryde telling this girl, Kate, this is something that happened in our past and this is who was involved. And I know that before we started the show, we were talking about that a little bit and how the intention behind doing that was to be able to tie this story into what was happening in the more modern X-Men series. I actually found it a little bit confusing, not so much jumping into this story, but I was just a little caught off guard by like, okay, why is there this dragon?
Oh, yes.
How does Kitty Pryde know this girl?
Yep.
So that was a little confusing to me, but I mean, in terms of like starting the story, it was like a good arc to kind of ease into it, because there's at the very end of their conversation, Kitty Pryde does say, I'd like to tell you a story about Eric and me and a man determined to save the world no matter the cost. He called himself a man of God. His name was William Stryker. And that was kind of a nice setup to the main villain.
I thought
of
so.
the
And then it
story.
was like, boom, first page from 1982.
Right.
I felt it was kind of it was a neat way to bring in some modern elements and it was a cool way for Kitty to say, this is where we came from, right?
Mhm.
Like she's telling someone instead of just blasting out this story.
Yes.
And, the funny thing is with Marvel Comics is even though Marvel officially started with Fantastic Four #1 in the 60s, and then now this was written like
82,
and then now we're in 2021. Marvel Comics has pretty much has a timeline of events, and they've said only about 13 years has actually passed in the comics world. So there's a lot happening in 13 years. My gosh, the Dark Phoenix saga and all of this.
There's been a roller
Civil
coaster,
War and
dramas, a soap opera.
You must think the Avengers are fighting like every other week,
Yeah.
Huge. The world is going to explode every other week. But
Yes.
13 years has passed. So for Kitty to say, this happened to me when I was younger, okay, that's cool. It's not like she's saying this happened 30 years ago. And you're
Right.
like, Kitty, you look like you're 28 years old.
Right. And she had, so, and then the baby dragon is like an alien and his name's Lockheed and he's adorable and he hangs out. So it's also cool to see that guy come back.
And for people who were reading Marvel at that time, that was a cool way to just say, okay, these are characters from now.
Yeah.
And this is what was then. But yeah, starts out, mutants are being hunted, and you're like, this is no big difference from what's usually happening.
Sure. Yeah.
Until you find out they're not Sentinels.
Yes. And I think that was a huge point of the story, was that they made the villain or enemy more human versus fighting giant robots.
Yeah.
Of the Sentinels, because that was their really big enemy for a long time, was the Sentinels. They're coming to attack us. They're hunting us down. They're getting more advanced and evolving as the time period goes on.
Right. Or what I'm used to, like Magneto and the Brotherhood.
Yes, that
Yeah.
too. Yes, Magneto is back.
And, it's interesting you say that because it's mutants fighting mutants.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is actually humans saying, no, we have a cause that we are banding together with, which is religion.
Yeah.
And they're saying you are not, not allowed or not invited to be on Earth because it's pretty much what it is.
And so the villain that we are going to discuss in this story of God Loves Man Kills is the Purifiers. And the Purifiers are kind of like a cult. A religious cult.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ties to religious cults, white supremacist groups. things of that nature.
Yep.
And at the time, these were topics that were, really
Yeah, it was blasted
relevant.
all over the news, I think, in the
Yep.
80s, if
Yeah.
I've read right.
Yep. And when this came out, it was again groundbreaking. We don't want to keep using that word, but it really was, because it took the X-Men away from exactly what you've been talking about, Anna. Is took them away from like just this sort of superhero-y fighting world. And hardly anyone in this comic has their mask on, including Magneto.
Yes.
And I think it's just to show that they're humans too, and
Yes.
not keep their mask on.
Right. Everybody's fighting for their own humanity in this book, trying to prove that they matter and they exist. And whether some groups don't want that to be that way, that's a whole nother thing. But they go into it in a way that is very educational, to say the least. And but in a way that it's more appealing to other audiences, and you can have that conversation.
So, do you think here's one thing that kept popping up in my mind when I was reading? When you watch like movies or read books, and the villains are monsters or mutants or aberrations or aliens, somehow it's not quite as scary as William Stryker.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, because William Stryker is very real.
Yes.
So as we kind of touched on in this story, he calls himself a man of God. So William Stryker is this televangelist, essentially, whose message that he is preaching is that the mutants aren't humans. They're not Homo sapiens. They don't belong.
Right. They're not descendants of God.
Right. And so he's trying to use that religious piece to convince his audience that the mutants, just by existing, are going against their religion and they are against God. And that, I think, is extremely scary, because as we've seen, various cults throughout history, you think of Charles Manson when you think of big cults, or Jim Jones, those sorts of things. You get sort of this cult of personality that has this idea that's relatable to the average person in some aspect. There's some aspect of reality, some aspect of truth, whether it be religion or what have you, but then they take it to the absolute extreme and then try to get their followers to follow this really extremist idea.
Well, and that's exactly right. The overarching problem in this book for the X-Men to face is they're used to saying, there's the bad guy, we have to smash him, right? Like, okay, now we punched and we're done.
Yeah.
And
you can't punch their way out of this problem.
Yeah, in this book, they're fighting an idea. They're fighting a movement. They're fighting like people's thoughts. And, once you get enough people banded together in fear, right?
Yep.
Then it's how do you battle their minds changing?
Yes. And that was what Xavier fought for all those years and everything. And this is kind of where the moment heats up, I guess, for that.
Yeah, I mean, it takes the same theme that I think people have always heard. And when you think of the X-Men, you're like, okay, they're mutants and they're still fighting for humans, even though humans despise them. And then,
right. They're sort of the outcast, the underdog. Like, they don't necessarily fit in to regular society because of these things that they're born with, these powers. And some of them have, morphic characteristics associated with their powers, like Beast or like Nightcrawler.
You can't hide it. Right?
Yeah. Right. But others look relatively the same phenotypically as an average human, but then they have these powers.
Yeah. So we kind of go through the story, and there's fighting in the streets. Kitty kind of, encounters like some people, like gang members and stuff. And she's like 13 and when this is happening.
Yeah. She's relatively like
fresh.
She's not a full X-Men. Really,
no, she's probably just joined up, been through a couple, fights and everything. And still, trying to figure out what's going on. She understands her powers at least.
Yeah, they do a good job of showing her powers. Like she's sort of, this story is almost from the viewpoint of her.
Yeah, I've heard, not to cut you off, but I've heard that Kitty Pryde and like a character like Jubilee when the cartoon was growing, they were like the reader or the audience
Yeah,
member.
because they were like the younger kids,
And
right?
they were kind of going along, and you were kind of following what they see from their perspectives. And
Right, because
the
they
world
had
they
kind of the most fresh eyes out of all the X-Men to,
Yeah.
being introduced to the group, understanding what the group was about.
Yeah, you're not going to follow Wolverine around.
Right, even though at school we made movies about it, comics, all that.
Right, but you
to
could
the
argue.
average team and the average viewer, we want somebody the audience can follow and the reader can follow. So I thought
they kind of build up like the dread a little bit. They kind of build up like what, behind the scenes, these terrible things are happening, but the X-Men don't really know that it's there yet. Like they do a good job. Chris Claremont wanted to set this story, I think, as like purposefully away from the rest of the storyline and the continuity. And just say this could be at any moment of the X-Men in its entire run, and the X-Men are still being published as comics. And then it's funny that they came out with this edition now because it could easily fit into any comic right now.
Yes.
So it was really nice of them to sort of keep that ambiguity. I mean, it keeps it fresh through the years.
So I guess after she gets off the street, she comes to the X-Men's mansion where they hang out as a family, as a team, and kind of train, grow together. And when Wolverine sees that Kitty got punched, she's got like a shiner, a black eye. That's when they know trouble's coming to their door. And they know that these problems are coming up. And then we cut back to like Stryker, who's kind of him and Xavier are trying to have an interview, but then Stryker's point of view from the media kind of gets kind of smothers Xavier's point of view. The camera's kind of cut in and out, and so that Xavier's message gets a little lost.
Yeah, and I think that was one thing that really struck me as something that felt very relatable to modern times, and also I think would have been terribly relevant also in 1982.
Yes.
Because you think of things like video killed the radio star, and, with the introduction of television and being able to see people's faces and their movements, they talk about historically John F. Kennedy was so much more charismatic and so much more presentable on television. And they feel like that really helped him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was terribly relevant because there is a line, during their interview where the camera crew makes a point asking, do you think that Professor X is making a good logical point? And the other member of the crew says, well, who cares? No one's really listening to him because William Stryker is so much more charismatic and he knows how to bring kind of the drama and the persona that makes for good television, whether he's got a good point or not.
Right.
Well, and he
sensationalize it.
Yeah. He already had a base of people. He already had the religious,
the cult.
Yeah. But even just people who are religious.
Oh, yeah.
He just said, hey, everyone out there who believes in God, and everyone's like, oh, okay. I mean, he already had that base.
Right.
Yeah.
So, that's a huge theme for a comic book to wrap its head around, but it's also a scary theme in a comic because, I give props to Marvel Comics and DC and Image and everyone else because they still keep religion in their books, and they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
They made their own world, and they could keep that out. But Marvel said, no, this is the themes of our world, and if we're going to make superheroes, we're going to say, what if these superheroes were in our world? And unfortunately, if mutants were in our world, this is probably not too far away from how they would be treated.
Right. And I was going to say, this was kind of in between that period where the Comics Code Authority was phased out, right? Or was on the way out?
Well, it wasn't, it was still in effect for probably another 10 years,
right?
At least, maybe more.
So,
but
they definitely
Marvel, if the comics code said, "Oh, you should change this," they were like, "Yeah, we're good," and they'll still
Right.
push it through.
Yeah.
Where before they were like scared to death, like,
Right.
"Oh,
Like more
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah." Like, well, if the comics code says it's changed, we won't get our publication, and I think at this point they were like, we can still get away with things.
Right.
There is a bleeped out word in there because they don't
Oh.
want that.
Yeah,
but
there is a racial
um,
slur that
Oh,
they
yep. Yep.
yeah, they weren't
used
allowed
in
to
the
use,
book.
and
Mhm.
but then you look at some of the artwork and it's like, oh, that was pretty graphic. How'd you get away with that compared to
Right.
just the words?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think for the X-Men in the day, they probably hit their reader base pretty hard with this story.
You
To just
have
really
to,
shock
right?
them out of
Yeah.
like, this is the real
Real
themes
world.
that the X-Men are going for. And that's why in Marvel they've always had mutants versus like everyone else, right? Like even in the superhero community, the Avengers and the X-Men never really got along because the Avengers don't really have any mutants, really, not much.
No.
Mhm.
Well,
X-Men
very
are all
once in a
mutants.
while they
Yeah.
did.
Right.
And so they kind of feared each other even then, and just distrusted each other even then.
Yeah. So then after all that, high intensity, Storm and Cyclops are like they were kind of like keeping an eye on Xavier, and they're like, oh, something's going wrong. But then we transition to, oh, hey, we're training in the danger room. Remember, we had a cartoon.
Yeah.
We'll have cartoons. We still train to do all the things, and so you still get this moment of them training, and it's kind of cool that they challenge themselves. Hey, Wolverine, can you escape this cage without your claws or without slashing the cage? Oh, okay, let me picklock it, I guess.
Yeah.
Cyclops, can you handle these missiles? And Nightcrawler, can you use your teleportation powers?
It's still fun that even then they were trying
still
to like
explore different ideas
show
and
their new
things.
powers.
Right,
Everyone tried to
yeah.
use their powers in different ways, and that was
Right.
cool.
And then there's that one point where they're like, "This is too hard. Hey, can we just trade places here?"
Yeah.
Right, yeah,
Cyclops,
because-
can you take that?
Yeah, part of their objective to start their mission in the training room was specifically like this character has to deal with this issue. Like they're supposed to
Yeah.
deal with this robot. Wolverine is supposed to deal with this cage by himself.
Right. Just
And
to
at
kind
a
of
certain
challenge them.
point, yeah, they kind of realized like, no, we're much better as a team. And if we kind of play to our strengths
Yes.
and have whoever's best suited to deal with this problem, deal with it, that really is going to work out better.
Yeah.
And that kind of helps them a little later, but they solve a lot of problems as a team, and then the only one that doesn't have a team is Magneto working on the other side.
Yes.
And like you said, he's always put together little groups.
Mhm.
Magneto's always kind of said, all right, we're the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, or well, we're gonna be, but in the long run, it's always just been him.
Right.
Yeah.
It feels
It's
very
just
much
him.
like even if he has a group, Charles Xavier has always been more of kind of the father figure, the mentor, the teacher
Yep.
to all of the X-Men that train at his academy, whereas Magneto feels very much like the authoritarian, like, this is my goal, this is my mission, I'm out for myself and my desires, and if this group of people is along for the ride, that's great. But they really feel very disposable to him.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's like a panel where he's talking about, well, I'm going to remake the world. And everyone's like, oh, well, you'll just be a dictator. And he's like, no, I won't. I'll make sure the world is, well fed and free of crime.
Yeah.
And so he has good intentions, but he realizes the only way to do that is to just make it happen, like just force it.
Yeah.
And so you have that other theme of like, do you wait for people to change their mind, or do you change their mind for them?
Yeah.
Right.
That's pretty
Yeah,
scary
how
to think
does
about
that
too.
work out?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then there's a car crash that they encounter as Charles is driving home. The purifiers, we get to see them more out in the open, and they immediately they dispose of both Cyclops and Storm, not kind of swiftly at that. They're kind of caught off guard, and their goal was to take Charles Xavier and kidnap him.
Mm-hmm.
And so the X-Men, they find out, oh, they just got in a car accident. Oh crap. Well, we better go to the hospital and figure out how they're doing, And then Kitty's kind of going back. She just hears the news, and she's kind of absorbing what's going on. And they find out they're actually being, I think, video camera, or like there's like a detector or something on there. And so like, oh, we're being spied on. And so that was very dramatic and everything to them. And they're like, well, what can we fear? And they're trying to figure out who their enemy is. Like, this is very different from what the typical villain of the day is going through. And then, they kind of come upon the purifiers, and they, Cyclops has not Cyclops, Colossus, he does this cool like car smash.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we got to get the civilian out. Okay.
And they do a lot of violence like off panel.
Yeah.
They always do like a lot of like
implied violence.
Yes. Like a gun fires and then you just see people
Pow,
scream
boom.
and you're like, oh,
they use the words.
Yeah.
The bam, pow, vroom, and they like to use those. And I actually thought that was really good to emphasize that scene.
Yeah, like, and then someone screams and then,
right.
Oh my gosh.
They did a good job with that.
Yeah, the reader has to kind of infer like what just happened before that.
Yeah.
And colors play a huge factor in that. Whenever there's some extreme violence, the whole page turns colors.
Yeah.
They did a good job on that part. There's some areas where I think the art sort of falls a little flat, but they at least keep the story going.
Oh yeah.
And when you're an artist versus Chris Claremont, the page is full of text. And I think Chris Claremont had an exact way of how he wanted the story to progress, and where he wanted the climaxes, and where he wanted the tension. And there's lots of stories where Claremont was like, no, I'm very specific on how these people are taking this.
Yeah.
From what we could tell, there's some interviews at the end of this book that him and Brent Anderson got along really well. And they really felt like they put out the best product that they could.
Right. And I believe that. And then, so as they're, trying to save this person from the car, and there's more like shooting going on. They're in the purifiers, have their like robot or super suits, I guess you want to call them. Magneto steps in. He's like, hey, I'm here to save the day. Like, whoa, okay. You're not here to kill us. You're not here to terrorize us. Nope. And they find out like the purifiers are something like assassins.
And Magneto takes one and starts like interrogating him, right?
Yes.
And Magneto, I thought Magneto,
and along with Wolverine.
Yeah, and then Wolverine sort of stepped back, like, all right, if you want to go crazy, go ahead. And so he starts, Magneto starts warping metal, and you get the idea. You think he's torturing the guy a little bit, and then Magneto says, once more, genocide in the name of God, a story as old as the race. So, in 2 sentences, he sets up like a crusade for all of history. Everyone knows that there was a lot of violence around God. And then at the same time, he says a story as old as the race. And so he kind of like distances himself from humanity entirely. He's just like, that's their battle.
Yes.
And he doesn't want them to bring it to Homo Superior. Yeah.
And then we find out where they took Charles Xavier, and he's getting kind of like they pose this like Christ imagery of him, which was very intense and raw, and they're giving him like nightmarish scenes, and he's like drugged up in this machine.
They have him in sort of a capsule. It looks like he's in water in some sort of like suit, and he's got something around his head, and he's got a little oxygen tank that he's breathing through, and they make him really disoriented. They say through the use of drugs and direct physical stimulus of the brain via implanted electrodes. And so they call it a mind wash procedure. And so what they do is they have this crucifixion imagery of Charles Xavier on the cross, and each of the X-Men coming to pay their respects, bid him farewell. None of them save him. They're actually sort of torturing him. And then William Stryker presents himself as, a hand held out in friendship. Why don't you join me? And so he's attempting to really brainwash Professor X, and get him to think that like, oh, these X-Men are evil and your way is the correct way.
Yeah, and one of his biggest fears forever has always been that Professor X feared that he would be responsible for the death of his children,
Right.
his X-Men,
Mhm.
because of what he sent them off to do, or
Yeah,
because
essentially, he
he
took them from their homes and trained them,
and
you
just
know,
said, trust me,
educated them.
and
Yeah.
and the other part of that too is that they turn on him, and I think that's another fear of his. Is,
Yes.
one day they're just going to say, "We've had it with you."
Mhm.
So it was interesting to kind of get into like the psychology of the televangelist, the psychology of the X-Men, the psychology of Professor X, the psychology
Yes.
of Magneto.
Right.
They wrapped a lot in. If you really think about it, in this graphic now, and they wrapped a lot of it in.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. And so we kind of get a little background on Stryker, and we find out, he had a tragic backstory, and he lost his, I think he lost his wife or something like that. And and he was in the service, and he didn't like what they did to him, and he was just trying to find an outlet for all his anger and hate.
Right. And I think the most kind of pertinent thing about William Stryker's backstory is that he tells the story of this car accident with his wife, his pregnant wife, and he delivered his son. And he's saying, my son was a monster. And then
Yeah.
he actually kills his wife and his newborn child. Um, and so you assume that the infant was born either a mutant
Yes.
or
Like a visible mutant, right?
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Born like Nightcrawler or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's really where his hatred of the mutants started, is he talks about his newborn baby and him feeling that it was a punishment from God of some sort, and then he reaches the conclusion himself that it wasn't his fault, it must have been his wife's fault, and it was a
Yeah.
punishment from his
Blames
wife.
other people. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the way that his story is progressing. He's just sort of placing blame with other
Other groups,
groups,
yeah.
and then he says, "Oh, and by the way, let's unite against the mutant." So he's,
Yeah.
Right.
that's the story
Outlet
as
for
old
his
as time
anger,
too,
yeah.
of like, where can we direct all of our anger to?
Yes.
And there are a lot of references that Magneto makes to World War II and to Hitler and the
Yep.
Holocaust,
Because that's his background.
that's
That's what
his-
he's familiar with, and he
Right.
doesn't want to see that repeat.
Yeah, so he says, I've seen this before. I've seen this,
Right.
play out. And that's why he wants to stop Stryker. He thinks he's well beyond dangerous than just having a group of cult people. Magneto sees this for what it is,
Yeah.
that this is a poisoned movement.
Right. And so the story progresses, we go through the public, and we get more assassinations on different groups and things like that. And diversity plays out as a huge role in the story, and it gets very graphic. And very intense as we kind of go along. Even what's happening to Kitty, she's trying to reach out for help while all this violence and shootings going on in the background. And she's like, I need help. I'm trying to get a hold of somebody. And there's explosions going on. You're like, you fear for Kitty, what's happening to her,
Yeah,
what's going to happen.
I mean,
next.
she's just as frantic as if we were in that situation. Good,
Right.
good,
Yes.
good placement of her.
Yeah.
Because not everyone
is intangible.
Yeah, well, and not everyone in superhero comics are superheroes.
Yes.
They get scared too. So
Yeah.
it does a good job of like her running through the streets just to get away.
Right. And then Magneto, again, this characteristic role of him being a hero, of helping Kitty and getting her and saving her from all the guns and all the fighting. And he uses his powers that kind of evolve over the course of the book here, but he uses magnetic powers like rip a train out and stop the bullets and everything that Magneto to be.
Yeah, and to kind of pause on the artwork a little bit, in each page there really is not much real estate to do a full art spread.
Yes.
they don't have a 2-page spread, or they don't
Sure.
really have even one whole. Sometimes you see them where they're big scenes and there's just
Right.
little words. I think it's because they were just trying to really densely populate this big story
Mhm.
into smaller panels and just move it along. And
I do like that it's oversized and we have an oversized
yeah,
Brent, so that
that
the
is
art
cool to
kind of
see that.
really pops out and stands out for what their goal was.
Right. And some of, I think, we were talking about, I believe, before we started recording, some of the criticisms of the art, feeling like it might have faltered a little bit because a lot of the background is like singular color. And I think that actually adds to the effect in some way because it makes you focus more on the story and on each individual character and what they're doing versus like the setting.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
and I mean, you could make a case for against that, but
Well, Brent Anderson, the artist, he also drew. And when I was reading it, I was like, because I read this probably. Oh, I'm always the old. I'm the old guy
the
here.
comic book
Oh,
collector.
back in the day. I did not read it when it first came out.
Oh, that's good.
I was a young toddler, but I read it easily when I was in grade school, like
Okay.
6th, 7th, 8th grade. I read it.
Wow.
And then I really haven't read it until recently because
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, yep, I read that. Check off the list.
Sure.
Keep going.
It was nice to revisit.
Yeah. And so revisiting it for me, I thought the story held up, the artwork held up. And I'm like, who is this guy? I knew this artist. And so when I looked up Brent, he drew Rising Stars, which
Okay.
again is a
Yeah.
great story written by J. Michael Straczynski.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I got that.
Yeah. Great story. Great, like written, but I felt the artwork was a little disjointed there. So I'm not maybe the biggest fan, but it, like, for me, it gets the point across. It progresses the story, and it's not like it hurts the story.
No, it definitely
So,
illustrates
yeah.
the story and brings it to
and
life.
it helps you read, and like you said, Anna, like you get the idea of what's happening, and then you go to the next panel. You get the idea of what's happening. You go to the next. You're not like lost, right?
right, you're not
So-
lost in the details.
Yeah. So he
Yes.
does a good job of just moving the story along.
Yeah.
Some artists,
And the
put a
energy and the
ton.
intensity of some of those really
yeah,
big
like
moments.
his expressions,
Yes.
his movements, like the faces. I think he just takes what should happen in that panel, and he explicitly draws that first idea of like, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
Goes from there.
Sure. So yeah, Magneto comes to save the day with the X-Men, which doesn't usually happen because Charles Xavier is usually
Yeah.
with them or helping them mentally.
And they're like, what do you want?
and now he's like kind of puts himself as like the leader of the X-Men, or self-imposed leader, or the stand-in leader of the X-Men.
He's always done that, though. He's always jumped in
Once in
when
a while.
Professor X
It doesn't
is
happen
wrong.
all the time, but
Yeah.
it's cool when it happens. It
It's
brings
like,
this interesting dynamic.
Oh, Professor X isn't here. I will run you now.
Yes, I'm your new father. And then we kind of, we get this point of Xavier kind of living in this different mind space, and he's being manipulated and talking to Stryker, and Stryker's trying to influence him, but also Stryker in his long plan is he's using him as a weapon. And directing his mind to shoot mind blasts, or however you want to call it.
Yeah. Isn't that weird? He wants to get rid of all mutants, and then he finds one, and he's like,
weaponize it.
I will
Right.
use you.
Yeah.
You are exactly what I need.
Right.
Oh, and you're a mutant too.
Yeah, so he kind of tries it out on Cyclops and Storm, because they're also captured. And he's like, "Whoa, this really knocked the crap out of him." Oh, okay.
And Stryker decides to have like a huge assembly of tons of followers, and he thought, at this moment, I will prove to the whole world that the X-Men are bad, right?
Right.
So now the X-Men are up against, do we fight? Do we show violence? That's exactly what they don't want to show. And they kind of make this decision, which I thought was really good in the story. They make the decision, after they kind of do their battle.
Yeah.
They make the decision of, we're going to use words. We're going to use ideas against words and ideas.
Sure. And I guess we should touch on how powerful Charles Xavier is.
Yeah. Everyone
Because
always
that's an underlying key thing, I think, in this thing that we take for granted, but it should be mentioned. Charles Xavier, not only did he help build Cerebro to find all the mutants in the world, but on his own, like, he can still like do a lot. So when you amplify a big mutant's power to be extreme, you can concentrate on, like in the movie X-Men 2, you concentrate, it's like, find all the mutants, Charles. Find all the mutants. And then focus, Charles. Focus, find them. And like their mind starts hurting. And like in this book, like they got nosebleeds and everything. But they almost become like immobilized. They're like, oh, they're in searing pain, like the worst migraine ever.
Yeah, you know, and you think about if he takes the whole world and they say tap into a certain type of person in the whole world, and if there's someone powerful enough to do that, I think every country in the world would say, yeah, we want to weaponize that.
Right. And you even find out people that weren't mutants on the surface, like one of the assassins that is William Stryker's like right hand woman, is actually has mutant genes in her, and
and she's impacted by this like sort of mental blast that Professor X puts out.
Yeah, which is like, whoa, okay, I didn't see that coming, so that was cool.
And then the X-Men realize, well, we have to either free Professor X or kill Professor X. There's no other way to stop this from happening.
Yes. And so this all takes place within a rally of the William Stryker, and which is where this whole story kind of is the climax of the story, I guess.
Right. And it's not just a rally, but it's a televised rally. They've got like the major news networks there. They have political figures there watching it. So it really is putting the X-Men on the spot in front of essentially the whole world, which, as Chris mentioned before, that sort of creates this conflict for them of, okay, like we don't want to physically fight too much because then we'll look like the bad guys on national television. We'll look like these powerful mutants that are trying to destroy humans.
Well, and I think then the story would just take this turn where Chris Claremont probably didn't want it to go. He doesn't want this to turn into the whole story goes by, and then at the end they single out a figure and they say, all right, if you just punch this guy, then everything's good.
Right.
So I think it would have ruined the theme of the whole book.
The meaning, the idea, the lesson. Lesson.
So here is the lesson, kids.
Yes.
Because this story did not come out as single issues.
It was
the
Marvel graphic novel, which we were experimenting with.
Yeah, this was like number 2.
Yeah.
So they started saying, why don't we make stories that are just graphic novels, which means that there are like 60 pages of just straight up story, and it's a one and done. It starts, here's the story, here's the problem, let's fix it, done. And nowadays they do that a lot. It's really common for just about any creator, artist, writer to say, let's write a story that's totally self-contained. But back in the 80s, it
wasn't a popular thing. It was kind of a
new
idea. So they were trying stuff out. And speaking of, so like Magneto, I like that the X-Men don't kind of rush in first. It's Magneto.
Yeah.
And we have this big Magneto versus Stryker. The two big ideas that are ideals of this book clash right on the spot.
Right. And also kind of the more extremist ideas, right? The more like forceful ideas, with Stryker representing kind of the genocide idea and Magneto representing the just force the ideas onto people and make it a part of their reality. Yeah.
And they're both like the same age, they're both just like
I would say
older
so,
guys.
You're like old dudes. Yep.
Yeah.
And even so much that Stryker's kind of like, use your power, Xavier, to blast Magneto. So we go, and Magneto is one thing, his helmet that protects him against like telepathic attacks, and everything just gets knocked off.
Yeah, it's like the first time he's wearing his helmet in the comic too.
Right. Yeah.
He armed up. He's all right.
Yeah.
And then we get this like really humane, little humane moment of like Magneto on the ground, kind of with like on the ground and people surrounding him. So he knows he can't be too extreme, but he also uses his powers to like back people off. And it's more of this ground fighting. And he's like, I can't fight my way out of this, or at least he doesn't think he can.
Yeah. And then even Cyclops, he starts coming into his own as
a leader.
Yeah. Straight up. Cyclops actually has been, if you look at the entire arc of the X-Men, he has been a polarizing figure. He's been a great leader. He's been a bad leader. He's been I've had enough of this kind of, walked off the team kind of, he's been all over the place. But in this story, he starts saying, no, we're standing up.
Yes.
We're not leaving. The fight isn't over. All we're going to do is delay the Holocaust. We have to approach it now.
Right.
And at this time in the comics, for a little bit of the Marvel history portion of it, if people were reading the X-Men religiously back then, Phoenix, died in 1980. So Cyclops has now had 2 years of comics that are like him
sulking.
Yeah, being sad, finding other ways, but also just saying, I'm going to run this team the best that I can, and so he decides to go out on stage.
Yes, and that is the big thing where they approach Stryker. Magneto's kind of taken a back seat to this at this point, and the X-Men present themselves to Stryker and say, all right, we're going to encounter this problem the right way and challenge you on our ideals and have the conversation. Mm-hmm. And it's very pivotal. And I think it's probably the most iconic moment or groundbreaking moment of this book is when he points at Nightcrawler and goes, human, you dare call that thing human? And Nightcrawler's like, I'm just standing here. It's not that it's a funny thing. It's just how he's posed is funny.
It's typical Nightcrawler.
It's pretty typical Nightcrawler.
Sort of
he's a little hunched.
Point.
Yeah. He's like, oh, hi.
He hunched a little bit.
Yeah.
And Cyclops makes a really good point too, that he says, for all you know, we could be the real human race and the rest of you, the mutants. He's kind of playing on that idea of evolution, right? But then earlier in the story, Stryker talks about evolution. People who talk of evolution are the same ones who are banding with the mutants. So he's starting to say, you're either evolution or you're either religion, God. And so it just all over this book really makes you think about
science versus religion.
Yeah, and what comics really could be.
And I guess my favorite quote is on the next page when Kitty is talking about Nightcrawler's generous and kind and decent. He had every reason to be bitter, every excuse to has become a demon inside and out. But he decided he'd rather learn to laugh instead. I hope I can be half the person he is. And if I can choose between caring for my friend and believing in your God, then I choose my friend.
Yeah.
And Stryker's like,
and that's the X-Men just saying what they feel and what they're.
And that was like, that's what this book is for me. That's like, hits it on the point.
Kitty brings it out.
Yes.
And, so it does kind of like wrap up where you're like, oh, all right, everyone's saved. But at the same time, it, deeply affected all of their characters. Chris Claremont is such a great writer. He uses these themes and these stories and the way that people reacted for years to come. Yeah. He had a long game planned for each one of those characters. And it's really great that he had a chance to work on them and keep going.
Yeah. And then I guess the last major moment is the eternal conflict of the X-Men where who's right, Xavier or Magneto's ideals?
Yeah.
And so Charles kind of gives up. He's like, maybe this isn't our world anymore. This isn't my fight anymore. Maybe we should just do it the forceful way. And the X-Men stand up to Charles and say, no, this is not what you had intended. We will follow that dream.
We're going to keep going.
And then Charles, I won't spoil that quote for you. It's a terrible quote that you should read as a reader.
And, it is. So in one way, it's a really great way to end an X-Men story, right?
Yes.
In another way, it's a really great segue into just years and years of writing X-Men.
Yeah.
And this helped solidify these characters even stronger into the beliefs in the comics. And they don't have to always say, because sometimes in every comic they come up with the, these are mutants and they are being, and everyone's like, we get it,
Yeah.
But it's great for someone to read this. They always intended new readers, old readers
Yep.
to read this.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that is always what we always try to find, is what's the best available copy. And when did this edition come out?
This came out
The-
last year.
the hardcover.
The gallery edition.
Gallery
did.
edition.
And then we, I guess me and Ramos here, we read it in the omnibus on
Yes.
the third Uncanny X-Men volume 3.
Omnibus Volume 3.
Three.
Yeah.
And then you can also read it digital. And then they also have like just your regular standard collected editions, soft cover.
And where did they throw it in? They threw it
They
in
threw
right
it
before
168.
Uncanny
So,
X-Men number 168.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Right. And so in this gallery edition, then the end of
Kate's story.
Kate
and
Kate's
Kitty.
story, they do go back to Kate and Kitty and kind of reflecting on the story that Kitty just told, and they kind of sum up, some of the ideals of, heroism has nothing to do with powers. It's seeing the light in the darkness.
Yeah.
And kind of just this idea of continued hope and continuing to fight for your dreams and for what you know is right.
Yeah. And that was definitely a very good concluding and heroic, thought and idea you want to get
just
across.
Have hope. Just have hope that things will change.
Because it's a very bleak book.
Yeah.
Even though there's like moments of like, ooh, cool power and the thing, it's
And
very
dark.
bleak book, and
It's
it's a
intense.
dark and
Yeah.
intense, and it makes you think and
it
feel
ends
things.
and you're like, well, they won, but
Did
what
they?
did they win? And,
Yeah.
they're
Right, like
still
they beat
alive.
Stryker, but there's still this idea that Stryker planted
Yeah.
out there against
Yes.
them.
They won't
There
go
are still
away.
people
They have
that
to
are
fight it
against them.
every time they go
Yep.
out.
And somehow they're still standing up for humans and protecting them, and that's just their thing. They protect humans even though the humans fear and mistrust them or whatever. That's the X-Men way. So we haven't really dived into a lot of X-Men yet in the podcast, but I think this is a story that maybe shouldn't be your first read. Maybe read a little bit of the X-Men as a precursor, like a beginnings, maybe or even some of the newer reboots, and then go read this. But you
Yes.
have to know the characters a little bit first.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to
It
really
helps.
understand.
Yeah, it does help. So maybe not the first read, but maybe like your 10th read. I don't know, something like that.
Sure. All right. And I think this wraps up another groundbreaking run. All right. This is Bam Pow Comic Hour with your hosts, Andrew Glonner.
And Chris Ramos, goodbye.
Anna Coleman signing off.
Bam.
Excellent. Goodbye.
Bye.